Well, hello everybody. This is Peter Deegan and welcome to another RSSL My Auditing Journey podcast. And today it's my pleasure to welcome Peter Rooney from RSSL. Hello, Peter.
Hello there, Peter. Nice to join you.
Thank you very much for being able to spend some time today to what we're trying to do with this podcast series is just study from the experiences of others. Perhaps you could give yourself a brief introduction about your background and role within RSSL.
Yeah, sure. My background is analytical chemistry for far too many years, but after doing about 25 years in analytical chemistry, I decided to take a detour into quality. So I left a chemistry manager role, which is what I've been doing for the past 6 years, and went to work for the United Kingdom Accreditation Service as an assessment manager and then a senior assessment manager and decision maker and technical focus person for various areas. So I was assessing to 17025, 17020, 17034, 17043, 15195, and I did that for 9 years and came to be head of quality at RSSL.
The first question I always ask, what was your first audit and what was your experience?
Well, I guess my first audit of actually conducting the audit would be one of the training audits while I was at UKAS, and I think my first one was in a gin distillery somewhere in the northwest of England, which was basically you'd been through the training courses, but now it's a case of, okay, go put it into practice, and there's somebody watching you all the time and sort of picking holes if you miss anything. But no, it was just an enjoyable experience, actually, because I like to talk to people anyway, and I don't have a sort of particular auditing style of, sort of routinely following a strict agenda. I tend to start off with an agenda and start talking, but then I will get led down various pathways where I want to dig and keep digging. And the more people tell me, the further I can dig.
That's an interesting one. Most people say my first ever audit was a complete car crash because I didn't know what I was doing and I hadn't had any prior training. So it sounds like you were well in control then, really, I guess, working for UKAS.
Well, I suppose I've been on the receiving end of 6 years of client audits at Reading before I left UKAS, left to go to UKAS the first time. But I'd also been running a contract lab for 10 years before that. So we'd had so many GMP, so many UKAS, so many client audits that I'd been on the receiving end of. Then I guess it just sort of felt like, okay, I'm just sitting the other side of the table.
That's a very interesting observation because that's one of the areas that we cover, particularly on our training courses. A lot of people who come on the training course want to be auditors, but they receive inspections and audits themselves, and we find that they learn through auditing how to be an auditee. I'd like to explore that a bit later, if we may. Clearly, the auditing courses that RSSL provide are really on the GMP and the GDP side, and we've got the UDRELEX standards and particular chapter 6 that we cover as our regulatory standard for QC laboratories. And it'd be interesting to walk through what chapter 6 covers and your experiences in what you observe, how you see companies complying and how you audit against that particular standard. So I'd like to just walk through the relevant sections if we can and just share what your experiences are, if that's okay.
That's fine, so long as you're going to remember what order the sections come in, because I don't.
Well, as a trained audit tutor, I've done my prep as usual, and I've got the guideline open on my third screen here, and I've made my notes and preparations, so I'm audit ready. So shall we give it a go?
Oh, let's crack on then.
Interestingly, it covers good control laboratory practice, and it is a very generic guidance. When you come in to audit a control laboratory at that high level, what are you looking for? What does good control look like at the highest level when you first almost come into reception to do the audit at the facility?
It looks like somebody who's actually got joined up processes rather than runs around in a panic as soon as you ask a question. I sort of start off and sort of on the introductions, you usually tend to get a feel of whether they're sort of paper-based systems, whether they're panicking themselves already, or whether they have got some sort of joined up process. So I would sort of start off on that end and sort of just start discussing their QMS, how it links together, what sort of levels of control they've got over it.
just going through the relevant sections, and it says, particularly 6.5, which is the good control laboratory practice, couple of paragraphs. Personnel and premises must be appropriate to the task. In particular, it talks about the nature and the scale of the laboratory must be assessed. You must have audited large multinational corporate laboratory capabilities that have multiple sites, multiple disciplines, right down to the very small contract laboratories. Are they different? Are they the same? Does scale matter?
Scale matters, but it matters due to the significance within the business that you're assessing. So yes, like you say, I've assessed trials with UKAS, national reference labs in various countries across the world, including UK sort of top level labs, right down to sort of one man and a boy type operations, or actually down to the extreme of two brothers working in their parents' granny annex, because granny had passed away, so they set up a lab in it instead. But you're then looking to see, well, what are they doing? Is what they're doing appropriate to the area? Is the level of hygiene, housekeeping, effluent control, waste control, fume extraction, even safe to be in that environment? As well as you're then looking at, okay, is it well enough equipped? Is the equipment all old, held together with bits of duct tape, or is it, the latest Agilent all singing, dancing, stormtrooper type looking HPLC system?
I always remember, because I'm an analytical chemist myself from my background, my first degree is in chemistry, and I started in the QC labs from a small generic firm in Yorkshire in England. And the thing that I learned was about the pharmacopoeia, because the pharmacopoeial test was for impurities was a thin layer chromatography, the little aluminium sheets with the silica gel on, and you put it in the flask. And then we started looking at HPLC systems, and we said, well, why is thin layer chromatography still relevant? And my QC manager was a very experienced person, and he said, because the pharmacopoeia needs to be replicated in any laboratory in any part of the world. It genuinely could have been a small hospital pharmacy in Malawi. They have to still do the testing, and that is the minimum requirement. How have you seen organisations move or stay along that technical path with regards to pharmacopoeial testing standards versus new innovative technology? And I'm looking at the auditing requirement against the pharmacopoeial standard, or the relevant standard, or the standard operating procedure, versus advances in technology. It must be quite a challenge, really.
It is, but if you're sort of talking instrumental, then I will start off sort of working, seeing what the basis of the requirement of the technique is within the EP or the USP, then expecting them to have evidence to demonstrate that their instrument has been qualified and is able to meet those criteria. So like I say, it doesn't matter if you've got the latest 1200 or if you've got a really old Agilent 1050, so long as it's still able to deliver the right, pump accuracy, flow, wavelengths, resolution. So long as they can prove the equipment is still fit for purpose, then they should be able to do the method. And like you say, there are still TLC methods in the EP and the USP. So yes, anywhere in the world should be able to do that. I'd like to think they usually can, but we have come across problems in the past.
So what you're saying is, don't be fazed by the inputs and the machinery in front of you. Look at the outputs, look at the specification and the regulatory requirement. That's how we train our auditors to what are the requirements, what are your audit criteria. You've got a thing in front of you which may well be small, large, complicated or not, but it's, do the outputs meet the requirements, and how can the auditee demonstrate that?
Exactly. So you don't prejudge. I mean, coming from my background, it'd be far too easy to prejudge and go and saying, well, oh, you haven't got the latest one? Well, it doesn't matter if you've got the latest one, so long as what you've got you can prove is fit for purpose. It does the job. It's reliable. You get the same results when you do it more than once. Then fine, you can demonstrate that your equipment is sufficient. It doesn't matter if it's 15, 20 years old, so long as you can still get it repaired, qualified, maintained. You shouldn't judge somebody because they can't afford the latest £500,000 one.
Building on that, how do you evaluate obsolescence?
Obsolescence, I would evaluate on, can you actually still get this thing repaired, qualified. If the check valves have gone in this HPLC, can you still buy them? Because if not, then you're not going to get anywhere. We've seen this recently on things like particle size, because we know the 2000 series Malverns are coming out of support. So sooner or later, the people who've got their methods validated on a 2000 series, they will hit a problem when they can't get the part for their 2000 anymore. So I would look at obsolescence and what their plans are to move it forwards and to revalidate on a more current piece of equipment.
I audited a laboratory not so long since, and they still had the digital tapes, and they'd moved on, and their tape reader broke. They had a massive archive of all the data tapes, and they couldn't read them anymore. They had to actually find a specialist company that can actually retrieve that. And I think that's an example of just be aware, particularly not only in equipment, but also in data retrievability for the future, because you've got to keep this data for as long as the regulations require.
Well, yes, because you're then falling foul of the Alcoa Plus of being enduring and retrievable. So yes, I totally agree. You have to look at the technology that goes with it as well. So if your mass spec is still running on a Windows 7 system, sooner or later you're going to have a problem.
Yeah, that's a good point. Coming now to the documentation section, I was just going through chapter 6. Some labs now have very complex systems, your LIMS, automated control systems these days. We talked about the nature and the scale of laboratories. Some still have paper systems in use, and a mixture of both. So when you're auditing particularly complex data-driven systems, what are you looking for with regards to documentation, because it's digital more than paper? And these days, more importantly, the management of that data. We've talked about obsolescence and retrievability of the data, but how does data integrity now come into these systems? The key question to me is, have these data-driven LIMS-type systems reduced the risk, or have their complexity increased the visibility of the risk because of its complexity?
I think the complexity has increased the risk, and certainly when you start getting your LIMS system talking to your other acquisition systems as well. So if you've got your chromatography data system feeding into your LIMS system, then you've got to make sure that the controls are there in place, that that data gets transferred accurately, reliably, but also can, depending on how and where you're backing that data up. I would hope it's not just via the LIMS system, because would you be able to pull backwards from the LIMS back into the CDS system to then prove what, if the original results were challenged? Paper-based systems for data recording, it does largely sort of take a lot of the data integrity electronic challenges out of it. Although you can then get into the challenges of, scanning in, is it a true certified copy? We've even taken the trouble to sort of, put loads of examples through our scanning system to make sure that, even if it's a screwed up piece of paper, it's, partially faded, will it still scan? Will it still be reproducible? But yes, I mean, for our own business, to make sure that we are comfortable with it, we will do a data retrieval challenge on all our instruments. And because of the sort of staggered software backup that we have and data backup, every year we will pull back data that is less than 6 months old and data that's more than 6 months old, and make sure they can still be read on the machines that they're originally generated on. Because if they can't, then once again, you're failing your systems. So, if I was auditing, I'll be looking to see what electronic systems they've got, what data storage systems they've got, how they're backing up, where they're backing up. Obviously, with cloud computing coming more and more to the fore, where is your cloud? What control have you got over the cloud? Do you own the data in your cloud?
And what is the security risk and intellectual property risk of it not being placed in your country residence as well?
Indeed, yeah. I mean, we will only use clouds that are based in the UK, Europe, or the USA, because that's where we've got sufficient confidence in the control. But even then, we'll be looking at the cloud providers and, like you say, what levels of security and ownership there is to those.
So, in terms of scope of an audit, you've been asked to audit that laboratory, and you see that they've got a cloud computing system. How far down that chain do you go? Would you actually go and then audit the data center, or would you assume that the data center, because they've provided you with the evidence at the laboratory, at the site, is satisfactory?
I would look to see what their approval of the data center was. So if it's a third-party data center, then you'd want to see what level of sort of assessment and inspection they did before they agreed to go with it. So I'd sort of want to look through their change control process, see what level of validation was done on the back of it. And if I wasn't happy with it, then yeah, I wouldn't expect to go and inspect their data center, especially if it was off-site somewhere, but I would raise observations that they would need to provide sufficient evidence to give me confidence in it.
It is interesting. I did a computer systems validation audit of a company in Helsinki, and I was most insistent many years ago on seeing the data center. And they went, okay. So as you say, they took me 35 kilometers into the hills. We went into the data center, and it was just a box of computer stuff. There was no real value in me actually having seen the data center. Having said that, interviewing the data center management and staff about the double redundancy, even of two separate power station supplies into it, and the double fiber optics, etc. It was a learning point from me because I physically saw it, but I don't necessarily need to actually physically go and visit the data center these days, although it's given me a lot of understanding about the right questions to ask, I guess.
It does, but how can they still prove that the data that they were talking about has gone to that data center and they haven't just taken you to their friendly one down the road?
That is a good point. I want to explore this complexity, information, documentation systems. The chain of actions, the chain of responsibility can go down quite a track. So when you're auditing, what's your experience about the level of what we call outsourcing? Chapter 7, control of activities, your calibration and your maintenance of equipment. It's not necessarily done by the organization which houses the piece of kit. How do you audit that responsibility chain when the company is contracting other services? Calibration, maintenance, provision, even reagent supply, etc. It's quite a complex area really to think about.
It is. I mean, for calibration and maintenance, I'd expect to be seeing service level of agreements with clear responsibilities of, which part the lab is responsible for, which part the third party is responsible for. But then you'd also be looking to see what the level of traceability is through that third party. If they're doing their balance calibrations externally, fine, I would expect to see them ISO 17025 accredited. If they were, I probably wouldn't look much harder at the actual approval of the body, so long as their certificates all stated that they were done under their accreditation. So it's not one of these where they've got one or two tests accredited, but they then need one or two calibrations accredited, but then they use them for something totally different. So you'd want to see the accreditation relevant to the activity that are being produced. If they haven't got that level of sort of accreditation, then I would be looking for evidence of the training of the engineers and then the traceability of the equipment that they're using. So okay, they may not be accredited to doing pressure measurements, but they should be using devices that themselves have got accredited calibrations on them, because sooner or later you've got to demonstrate this traceability back to NIST or equivalent.
And the data, the raw data that is used in that calibration, is it okay for the calibration company to have responsibility to keep that data and it's available on request? Or do you as the client want copies of that data and your records in the case of the company going out of business or such like?
I would want to see the service level of agreement, because I would expect it to be defined in there what would happen in the event that the company failed, that data could be transferred over. It's one of those questions, isn't it? How far do you go? And I think you have to sort of take it on a risk basis of, what is the risk to patient safety if they've lost the raw data behind doing a balance calibration that was used to then, weigh out the ingredients for a master batch.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's where my experience is in that auditing environment, is that critical information is a copy is available at site if there may well be an unannounced inspection or there may well be a client audit. You would want that data to be presentable at the right time, rather than, service level agreement says we'll provide you that information in 7 days or such wise.
Yeah. Yes, you want to make sure that you can get the data that you need when you need it.
Can we talk about data integrity? The pharmaceutical industry has been on a great and positive journey as regards data integrity. We are, in some ways, privileged to be able to see the US FDA warning letters as publicly available information, and we learn a lot from those. What does good data integrity look like when you're auditing a laboratory, and what are the key risks or common errors that you see?
I think the common errors I'd see are people assuming that just because there's an audit trail there, everything was fine. I would expect to see them looking at the individual audit trails when they're doing their regular data review. So they're always looking to make sure, okay, there weren't any extra runs done. There isn't anything that they've ignored. They haven't injected this sample 7 times just to get 2 decent replicates. So you'd be looking for that level of review. But in terms of the data integrity on the machine, you'd expect it to be able to show everything that was done, including every tweak to the method, every tweak to the integration. So any change that's made is clear, obvious, and then has been reviewed by a second party, who obviously must be approved and trained to look at those. But yes, data integrity is one of those things that we all know there's equipment out there that you can't get fully CFR 21 compliant, in which case that's fine. But what support measures have you put in place to fill the gap?
Yeah.
So, have you got additional logbooks? Have you got additional, sort of photographic evidence? What else are you doing to fill the gaps?
So essentially, you've done your risk assessment and you've got evidence to demonstrate that it's covered to mitigate the risk to a manageable level.
Yes, and then you're re-reviewing that risk assessment periodically, and certainly if you make any changes. So as part of your change control, there should be a further review of the data integrity gap assessment.
Could I explore your experience in viewing audit trails? The data integrity guidances say audit trails should be human readable. What's your experience of that human readable phrase?
Well, my experience is only, again, it's only what we apply here. So if we are looking at a new software system, then one of the things that we'll be looking at is how good and how readable is that audit trail. If it relies on being able to deep dive into an audit log rather than just being able to clearly see things, then it's not ideal. We would like to see it sort of say, method change this parameter, samples added to the sequence, nice and clear, so that there's no question about what's been done, but there's no simple answer to it. I'm afraid it's just a case of you have to look at the systems that you've got and see if they're workable, and even if they are the less readable version, so long as you can write enough instruction for the reviewer to know what they've got to look at and how to spot the mistakes, then it's probably, it may be the best that you can get.
In one of my recent audits of a laboratory, the auditee was very insistent that the responsibility for that audit trail provision and demonstration of ability for human readable was on the proprietary company that provided them with the system. They didn't really see that they had any responsibility. It works and it's fine. It prints it out. We've got an archive. They really weren't reviewing that information and that data. We asked to see an example copy of the audit trail, and after lots of sighs, they managed to get it off their system, and it just really was just thousands of data points. You really couldn't assess that well. They were very surprised that we'd given them a major finding of that. I think the major finding was not necessarily about the complexity of the printout. It was the fact that they hadn't understood the responsibility to review that and why an audit trail is there in the first place.
Yeah, I think part of my finding on that would have been, why did they select that software with an audit trail that they weren't comfortable with and didn't really understand?
It comes down to that risk-based thinking, risk-based approach. In such technically challenging new innovation systems, we forget the fundamentals, that the whole reason behind this is patient safety. And therefore, what the risks to that data corruption, that data manipulation, that data management that isn't readily viewable.
Yes, I mean, it's the version of the electronic Tipex.
Yeah. So I want to talk about the section on sampling now. It's quite a detailed section. samples must be representative of the batch. It's very clear statements about how to sample, what sampling requirements there are. When you're a contract laboratory, you're very much reliant upon the client to have made those decisions. How do you work with the client, probably through the quality agreement, I guess, to make sure that you as a contract laboratory, the samples that you're testing are representative of the batch? Is that your responsibility, or are you just testing them?
Ultimately, it's not our responsibility. We are testing the samples that are submitted, but then we have caveats on the reports to say that the results only are applicable to the sample as submitted and may not be representative of the batch as a whole. In my previous life at UKAS, then yes, sampling did become part of the process, and there you are then starting to look at, what's their sampling plan, what's their regime, what's the risk failure. So, starting to say, okay, are you willing to accept a 1% error? Are you a 0.1%? Or are you a 0.01%? So, are you going to sample 10 samples, 100 samples, 1,000 samples? And how are you then going to subsample from your 1,000 samples, or are you going to test all of them? So, yeah, sampling plans can get very complex, but as a contract lab, we test the samples that are submitted to us, and it's down to the customer to ensure that those are representative, which, okay, yes, you will get the occasional out of specification where they will then resample and send in another sample, and it's not the same as the original one that you got. So there is a sampling issue, but in which case, we are being honest and reporting all results. So they can see that there was a question over the first one.
And as an auditor, it almost draws you into giving advice to the auditee. And we always talk in our lead auditor courses, ISO are very clear that you cannot give free consultancy and advice. You're there just to view the conformances or non-conformances. And it's up to the auditee to take that understanding and risk. But you can't help but advise or coach, or however you want to look at it. What's your thoughts on that?
UKAS would obviously sort of defend the point you just made, but they also sort of would not sort of have any major concerns, as long as you weren't sort of really directing. If you sort of say, yes, okay, we can see you've got a problem. There's a few things that you might want to consider. You probably wouldn't be too heavily criticised for sort of turning around and saying, well, I've been in other labs and they've approached it this way or this way or this way. As long as you don't give them one route, you could sort of give them a number of options that they would then need to investigate for how it would fit into their own systems to both close the finding out but also be workable for them. You're not going to give them a sort of this is how to do it type instruction, but there's nothing wrong with sort of giving them things that they might not have thought about.
You're right. It's a hard one, isn't it? Because you're as an auditor, you are very privileged to see more than one facility, and that's where, as an inspector, you've got that industry level view as well, and therefore you can impart more information and guidance. But it is a fine line. As long as you don't accept responsibility for the process that you're auditing as regards the auditee, then shaping them might well help. Because I've had many examples where one gives a non-conformance and the auditee says, where do we start? And you can't just say, as per ISO, it's up to you, mate. Where we teach trainee lead auditors through the RSSL course, we help the audit trainee understand auditing is one sampling process of an overall vendor assurance procurement process. And the reason why you're auditing is sampling to see, is this business that I'm either outsourcing to me or vice versa, is it conformant with the requirements of my specification, my license, my authorization? And it is a mutually beneficial commercial partnership where you're moving together. There's no point in you saying it's up to you, mate, because then that will come back and hit you as the client anyway.
Yeah, I mean, the line that we use to UKAS is that, we are not giving you consultancy, but we're giving you added value by sharing some of the knowledge of what we've seen in the past.
That's really good. I like that tremendously, because it's about, you look at ICHQ 10, bringing in real value to the pharmaceutical industry from the ISO standards to say we have to have continuous improvement. We have to have knowledge management. Sharing knowledge is mutually beneficial as long as you say, the auditee takes responsibility for that action.
Yeah, as long as you're not breaching any confidentiality in what you're sharing.
Yeah. So I want to now talk about testing and the equipment that you're using and the processes that you're using, and the people that are doing that testing must meet Annex 15 validation, Annex 11 electronic record signatures, computer systems validation. There is an ever increasing amount of data, electronic or otherwise, now produced. So when you go in to do an audit, there is a sea of data. There is a huge mountain of information. What's your approach in selecting and choosing which components of the validation process to audit and to review? Because otherwise you're going to be there for a week, never mind a day.
Yeah, I'm afraid it comes down to gut feel. You read through the summary, you read through the sort of the preamble and the general protocol, and then you just sort of think, now hang on, that doesn't quite link together. So it gives you an avenue to go down. You know, they always say an auditor can walk into a room, you can have 14 files in front of you, and the one you pick up will have the mistake in it. It seems to be true.
I couldn't agree with you more.
It doesn't necessarily mean that there weren't mistakes in the other 13 as well, but the one you've chosen has got a mistake in it. But yeah, it just gives you avenues to go down. So if there was nothing that flagged up to me there, then I would pick a couple of sort of probably key figures out, and then probably a couple of sort of less important figures, and want to sort of drill down on those and see what the traceability of what the sport is behind it. Then that then sort of leads you into the equipment qualification, into the training of the individuals and the traceability of the reference materials, even the supplier approval process. I just use it all as a sort of a route to dig down into the whole, how well knitted together the QMS is.
I use what I call the Peter Deegan patented process of the analogy of the soccer ball, football, which has got hexagons on it, and each part of the hexagons which make up the football are part of the components of equality system. And I was always taught that as an inspector I would go in and just pressure test it and push it. Is it pretty, on a high level? Is it solid? Is it there? Are the key things that you'd expect there to be there? Or is it a bit spongy? And you go in through the spongy bits, because then that can come back out and help you understand the links to other systems. So that gut feel is that pressure testing, looking for the spongy bits, I think is sort of the way I would put it.
If you take that analogy, yes, you look for the spongy bits, but if there's no spongy bits, then I would take off one of the panels and look underneath it.
As an auditor, one must be competent in the subject area that you're auditing. We are asked these days to audit more and more. We've got specialist areas. There are certain areas that I would say, I'm sorry, I'm not competent to audit. One of the areas that challenges me particularly, because I've got analytical QC background, but is the stability program. So I would usually bring a co-auditor with me. And once again, Chapter 6 has got quite a significant set of requirements with regards to stability programs. What's your experience in auditing the stability program as regards to the laboratory responsibilities?
I don't have much experience in auditing the stability program of anything other than our own. So if I was auditing our own, I would be looking start off with the protocol, what was set down, what samples were set down, when were they due to be pulled, what was the accuracy of the pull, ensure we've got the traceability behind all the temperature and humidity measurements, that we're pulling within the specified windows, rather than focusing on the testing at that stage. And if all that's there, then I'm comfortable that we're probably able to run the protocol and manage it well. But you'll be looking at the access into the stability chamber logs. You'll be looking at the pull logs. You'll be looking at the annual qualification of the chambers as well. So again, you tend to sort of cover multiple bits in the same way as we sort of discussed previously. You never just look at one part.
My final area for discussion today, Peter, is that of quality culture. We've now got ICH Q10 that drives management commitment, leadership, continuous improvement, knowledge management. So now we've got a clear direction from the guidances about the responsibilities of management, the tone and feel of the quality culture of the factory. We've now got the FDA quality management maturity model come through about where in that cycle are you as an organization. As an auditor, one is trained to look at the processes, the data, the information. How do you look up and gauge quality culture during an audit?
Well, I think to some extent you start off with a quality policy and their sort of quality policy statement, and then you look for evidence behind what they say they're doing. So you want to see the frequency of their meetings with management, ensure these are recorded. Okay, they're not going to show them to you, but they can prove that they've done them. They can prove they're raising actions, that they're following up. You'd look for sort of levels of communication cascading down through meetings, just how they're meeting that statement reliably, consistently. It's one of those things that you tend to get a feel for. There's a red rag to a bull to me. If anybody says, oh, no, that's above my pay grade, then it immediately flags a concern.
So when you're going through at the detailed level, at the laboratory, the bench level, what does good quality culture look like? What are you observing that people are doing or the facilities look like? Because it's more than just people is quality culture.
Yes, you would expect the place to look clean, tidy, well maintained. People aren't rushing around trying to do too many things at once. They are taking the time to sit down, write their notes at the time. There's no scraps of paper sitting around where they've written something down and transfer it later on. All the things that GMP stands for really is what you expect to see every time you go in. So, it shouldn't be too cluttered. It should be workable. It should be safe. It shouldn't be too many distractions. People should be able to sort of clearly get on with what they need without being interrupted too much.
I saw recently, I was auditing a laboratory and I saw the reagent fridge, and at the bottom of the fridge was a big sign printed out in handwriting, do not block this vent. And guess what was happening? There's a huge load of bottles at the bottom. It's that ability for the organization itself to stand back and look at itself. Maybe self-inspection programs need to look more about the look and feel of the factory, look at the feel of the firm. What is an American phrase, which I really like, is called curb appeal. When you first present it to reception, when you first walk into the laboratory, are the samples stored correctly? Are they stored neatly? Is the documentation linked accurately to that? Do they know what they're doing? Is there a purpose? Is there a clear regimen? And people look behind themselves and look forwards and sideways to see, is my environment working okay as intended?
I would agree with you. So if you walk into somewhere and all the samples are just in one large bucket, I'd worry.
Which I have. More than it was a calibrated bucket, as they always say, but it's always been said as an auditor, within the first 10 minutes, the outcome of the audit, really.
It's like interviewing somebody, isn't it? You get a feel for the professionalism and the level of knowledge from the first 10 minutes.
And that's really useful. So it sort of meets my experiences. I think quality culture is an incredibly important element. It is the baseline. You can have the most fantastic systems. You can have the most fantastically accurately calibrated. But if the culture is right, the approach is right, the fact that the people understand what their part in the cog is as regards patient safety, efficacy and quality, rather than I just do this. I think that's really important.
It is one approach that we used to use that was quite effective usually in smaller businesses. If you ever had any doubt, is you would set aside half an hour and want to interview the managing director.
Yeah.
Ask them what really goes on in their business, how much control they've got, what their involvement.
Yes. A lot of our trainees come on because they want to be auditors. But again, as I said earlier, a lot of our trainees come on and they host audits, they host inspections. Clearly, as a contract laboratory such as RSSL, you get audited and inspected all the time. What advice would you give in hosting an audit?
So, as you say, yes, we had a lot of audits. Last year, we hosted 55 client audits. You need to prepare beforehand. You need to know, what materials they're sending, what labs are involved, pull out some projects so that you've got them ready for them. But I think what we find most important, and the three of us that host the client audits, is knowing our system well enough to defend that what we do meets the GMP requirements rather than what the auditor's expectation is, because that's what their system does. So you need to be able to defend how your system meets the needs and obviously back that up with evidence. So otherwise we could be changing policies 50 times a year because every auditor's got a slightly different approach on how we should do a deviation. But so long as you can be confident in your own organisation's ability to do it and do it right and do it repeatably, then you should be willing to stand up and say, that's your opinion. It's not necessarily a non-conformance unless you can show me an actual clause that it doesn't comply against. And if it's your opinion versus my opinion, if you can find evidence that it doesn't work, fine, we'll look at it. If you can't put evidence behind it to suggest that what we're doing falls short, then we will we'll stand by our position.
How much importance, therefore, in that audit preparation to receive an audit, do you put on setting your self-inspection program?
Well, the self-inspection program is set for the year anyway, so we make sure that all areas are covered with the required frequency and that they're being conducted and suitably reported on, so that we've got confidence in the area. The seniors in my team are looking at those audit reports as well to make sure that we're consistent by benchmarking our auditors, and by doing that, you then got a level of confidence that we already know that area is fine, so we can sort of have the confidence when the externals come in.
And how do you factor in the audit findings from your auditors into the development of that risk-based self-inspection program?
So if we were finding a particular area that was flagged up on more than one or two audits in the year, we would be focusing extra audits on that area ourselves, and doing a deep dive, making sure that our area is sort of future-proofed in that area as well. Because a lot of the audits that we receive, they are the large pharma companies, so they will be sort of well aware of the regulations, and they'll be driving their own systems to be ahead of the regulations, and they'll be expecting ours to do likewise. So you just need to sort of be making sure that if we're starting to see something 2 or 3 times, well, maybe we have got an area that we need to focus on.
Hopefully those listening into this podcast have gained some insight from yourself about auditing, this time in laboratory functions. But from your experience from the UKAS accreditation side, and then for the contract laboratory side, receiving and giving of audits, what advice would you give to somebody who's starting their auditing career journey?
Don't be afraid to make mistakes, but be willing to admit when if you're going to raise a non-conformance and the lab's going to push back, ultimately you might have to agree that you were wrong. So don't be afraid to admit that you were wrong and sort of step back. Every day is a school day. There's no right or wrong way to do it. Well, there are wrong ways to do it. The wrong way is to sort of dictate that this is how you must correct it. That's not the right way to do it. But experiment with it. See what works for yourself. There is no one hard and fast way to audit that works for everybody. This is what we used to train out at UKAS, that, okay, we will put you through the training courses, but then you will learn your own style. But, be friendly with who you're auditing, break down the barriers. If I was technical assessing somebody and sort of witnessing their test, then usually sort of while they're setting up, I'll sort of find some common ground just to break down the barriers. So whether, if they're an Everton fan, then don't try and wind them up about Liverpool. Or
I think that interpersonal skills is absolutely fundamental. You've got to start somewhere. You won't be totally refined and experienced, but use those experiences to learn. But I really like what you say about it's a collaborative approach. It's not a them and us approach. It is a mutually beneficial commercial partnership. The audit is not the last time that the company will work together. It's a sampling of capability against a regulation or a requirement, but you will be doing business together, and it's that constant dialogue, and it's making sure that your collaborative approach allows the ability or removes any barriers for that contract laboratory or that supplier to phone you up to say, we've got a problem here, rather than hide it because the audit went particularly negatively and the relationship was damaged.
It does, but also bear in mind that audits are usually out in the lab talking to some of the junior people as well, and they will be nervous. So, put yourself back in those shoes. How would you have felt 20 years ago if you were there? many is the time when I've sort of been witnessing somebody who's supposed to be weighing out the sample and their hands are shaking so much it's more like scattering it on the bench than putting it in the beaker, in which case I would sort of say, I'm just going to go off and look at this instrument record so they don't think you're looking over their shoulder anymore, and just watch from a distance. Takes the pressure off them. Then they act more naturally.
I think that's a brilliant observation, and it's the auditor's skill in being able to audit a cross slice of roles. Everybody's got an important role in the business. They've just got different levels of responsibility. And I always say, hello, I'm Peter, I'm the auditor. Can you tell me what you do today? And then I thank them. Thank you very much. Well done. Just walk away, because you just want to observe what they do. It is not a competition, and it's not a highbrow, I'm better than you. I think it's really important, and that's where a good auditor really earns their crust.
Yeah, and if you don't understand what's going on or you think something's wrong, then challenge it at that stage, because they may be able to explain why it's actually correct, rather than it coming back to the closing meeting as a nasty surprise and the lab didn't get a chance to defend it.
Yeah, good point.
And do it in a non-confrontational way.
That's a perfect segue example, because that's how we train our trainees, our audit trainees in our training courses. The real case studies that we work through really help to push buttons in a caricature way to help them understand what good auditing looks like. So that's really useful feedback, Peter, because it's really where I certainly put a lot of emphasis in making sure that your interpersonal skills, your human-to-human interactions, your respect of people, because it's just an assessment of conformance at the end of the day.
Yeah, you're doing a job, they're doing a job.
Very much so. Peter, it's been a real pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much for your insight and your openness in being able to walk through, particularly the laboratory auditing environment. So thank you very much for your time today, Peter.
You're very welcome, and I hope I haven't put anybody off being an auditor.
Oh, believe me, I think you're going to get people phoning up RSSL to come on our training courses tomorrow. I'm sure that'll happen. Thank you very much, Peter.
Thanks a lot, Peter.